Keep the applause going for yourselves for showing up. Go ahead, yeah. Self-love is the best kind of love. And when we talk about mental health, I think it's important to talk about self-love and really get that out there in the conversation. But if it's okay with you all, I want to start this entire session with the rap verse that I wrote. Is that okay? Since we're talking about hip hop, it could be a cappella, so don't worry about it. But we'll do it like this. From the land of illegal search and seizure, gotta work to earn your leisure, where they pray for Jesus when the world is burning fever, where the truth can still deceive you, what doesn't hurt you can free you, where every Instagram influencer ain't really your leader. I'm here now. Take a minute, really listen and put your beard down. I turned the other cheek and faced death, had to stare down. Spent too many years ignorant, I'm aware now. The system is scared now, my vision is clear now. Removing my blockages, in my 40s rapping, still I'm feeling like a college kid. Didn't have a pot to piss, still I have a lot to give. Strictly for my people, what you hear is my Tupacalypse. Tell me, are you watching this? What I say is iconic, raised where crack cocaine was part of our Reaganomics, and nothing really changes. Politicians stay demonic. I'm ready to leave the planet because my brain is a rocket. I'm to plug the light in the socket. I'm wired like fiber optic, psychic or psychotic, rocking Alanis Morissette. Is it an ironic? My abilities bionic. I'm illmatic and the chronic. Either way, I astonish, but people will never recognize a dime until it's polished. Moved in with my brother, I was dropping out of college. Now I'm the people's professor, teaching you to do the knowledge. Make some noise. All right, we're lit. We're warmed up. Once again, my name is Marlon Richardson, and I am the Education Director and Acting Executive Director of Hip Hop for Change. We are a nonprofit based out of Oakland, California. We've been around 10 years, and we specialize in teaching kids the true foundational principles and history of hip hop culture as a healthy form of self-expression, as a form of community empowerment, and all of those things. So you're gonna go with me on this cute, amazing little presentation I put together that combines my personal story, the history of hip hop, and what we're seeing in the landscape as it relates to mental health, mental illness, wellness, and all of the things. Like Peter was as kind as to talk about, this is our mission statement, right? It's a very long, grown-up way of saying that we're using hip-hop to empower ourselves and empower the communities that we're coming from and empower young people who are on the verge of understanding their own identities. A little bit about myself. I'm a proud New Yorker, born and raised in New York in the height of what I call the golden era of hip hop. So I'm an 80s baby. I was in high school in the 90s, and I was literally able to see all the iconic artists of our time within hip hop culture grow up. And I think that had a lot to do with my upbringing and the way that I came into my own awareness of things. But like the screen says, I'm an MC, I'm a beat maker, I'm a producer, hip hop educator, overall hip hop creative, and I go by the artist name UnLearn the World. This is more of a mission statement than it is anything else. It's a constant reminder to myself to break down societal conditioning, more particularly the conditioning that I've accepted or I've agreed to about myself and people like me. I grew up in Washington Heights, New York. I am a Afro-Latino, Black identifying young boy from that neighborhood. What's unique about my story is that from 0 to 13 years old, I was raised by a woman who was white and Jewish. Now, the reason why this is important is because I spent a lot of my very formative years being the only person of color in predominantly white spaces. That gave me a sense of hyper-awareness that then ended up helping me throughout the course of my life, right? Trying to understand why certain things were done or said around me or not said around me, understanding or trying to understand why people had more of affinity to my lighter-skinned younger brother than myself, right? Just seeing the way that people would navigate around me because of my own blackness. I didn't identify my own blackness, the world identified it for me. And it got to a point that through hip hop, I owned it. And it became one of my superpowers. So I approach this work not only as a lover of hip hop, but as a person who is in debt to what hip hop did for me. As a kid who grew up not only in this very unique experience, but in a neighborhood that was riddled with poverty, with crime, right? A lot of those misdeeds being committed by people in my own family. being involved in a family that had a lot of drug use, drug selling, alcohol abuse, domestic abuse, all of these things. And it wasn't until I was an adult and actually starting to do this work in hip hop education where I was educated into the very concept of trauma and to the concept of fight or flight response. And when I fully understood trauma and what it does to the brain, and when I fully understood fight or flight, it explained my entire academic career. It explained why classmates of mine would flash at the teacher for being called out or singled out in a classroom. It explained why kids were so quick to fight each other in certain environments, right? It gave me an understanding of my normalized dysfunction. And I normalized dysfunction because for me, it was commonplace for these things to happen. I would watch the movie Goodfellas and I was like, that's like my family. Not recognizing that this is not the normal experience of most well-adjusted people. So it helped me venture off into this exploration of self, right? By the time I'm 10 years old, I'm trying to rap to make sense of my unique upbringing and my unique experiences, literally just as a creative outlet. By the time I was 13, all of these albums became the soundtrack to my life, right? If you're a 90s baby and grew up with these albums, make some noise for yourselves, right? Arguably the best generation of hip hop ever because there were so many diverse stories before hip hop became $1 billion industry, before it got owned and operated by the corporations. We had our mom and pop record labels. We had our mom and pop radio stations that would play hip hop maybe once a week as opposed to home for hip hop and R&B, right? Like it was a different time. But in this, all of these artists, in lieu of me having my own father, became my father figures. Became my older brothers, became my OGs. And it was one song in particular, I actually get my rap name from it, from the Nas album, The World Is Yours, this song here. Who remembers this song if you grew up in the 90s, right? So I actually get my rap name from this song. UnLearn the World is because it's this song that made me want to take my rapping seriously. Right? When Nas says, writing in the book of rhymes, all my words past the margin, I understood now the concept of metaphor, right? As a kid who went to school and recognized how dangerous it was to go past the margins, I understood the metaphor of breaking that boundary. And it was literally the next day I went to like a CVS type store. I think back in the days, they had it Woolworth, if you remember Woolworth. And I bought my first rhyme book. So from 13 until present day, I'm still an active writer. And it was very unique in that my rhyme writing served as a journal. I put forewords in it. I put notes to myself in it, aside from songs and rap lyrics and all of these things. It was my way to make sense of everything. And I always hearken back to this. We just celebrated the 30th anniversary of this album. For those who don't know, Illmatic is in the canon of classic hip hop albums. Easily and arguably one of the most influential albums of the 20th century going into the 21st century. It was written by an 18-year-old boy from Queensbridge named Nasir Jones, right? He just won Grammys maybe a few years back, but I am indebted to this album and I'm indebted to that rapper because it helped me at least start the journey of self-exploration, and then that journey led me to self-healing and mental health and wellness. But I want to hear from you all, right? And also, what better way to be introduced into your pathway of wellness than a song that tells you the world is yours, right? Like that's just a sidebar. But I want to hear from you all. When I say the word hip hop, what are some words that come to mind? Not artists, but particular words. I'm not looking for anything specific. Just raise your hand and shout them out. Culture, beats, expression, change. All of these are great. You can give yourself a gold star, pat yourself on the back for that. Like, I'm assess and inviting you to assess your relationship with the actual word, let alone the culture. And we're going to get into the culture in just a bit. A couple of concepts I want to introduce as we're getting into this talk is I see hip hop as a social justice movement. As we talk about the history of it, you'll kind of understand why I see it as a social justice movement. The word in and of itself is a buzz term nowadays, especially in liberal Bay Area or seemingly liberal. It's really not grounded in a lot of understanding. So when I talk to my students, I make sure they are grounded in the understanding of the actual word. Justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. right? I submit that hip hop starts foundationally as a social justice movement. It wasn't until a little bit later that I also understood that hip hop and hip hop culture is also a wellness movement. It is a way for young, marginalized people to heal themselves from the traumas induced by the society that they exist in. And we'll continue with that concept as well. A couple of other concepts to understand. When I was an adjunct professor at Holy Names University, I created this definition of hip hop. It's my personal definition. It's a medium of self-expression where community is created through the performance, celebration of shared experiences, desires, and circumstances. Right? The main three words here are community, performance, and celebration. Community and activism is how human beings have historically thrived throughout the course of human history, starting with our insular families, branching out into our extended families, our tribes, our nation states, so on and so forth. We need each other to survive, right? What's unique about hip hop is that it doesn't create community based on proximity. It creates community based on ability and based on a foundational understanding of basic ideas, right? Mainly in a common space where performance and there is celebration. We're here to celebrate life because around our neighborhoods, there was death and there was destruction. Another thing I like to say, and I think is very appropriate to the theme of this conference, is that hip hop is remix culture. One of the very first MCs named Grandmaster Caz, he was part of a collective called the Cold Crush Brothers. He was quoted as saying, hip hop did not invent anything, it reinvented everything. We are continuously reimagining and reinterpreting through the lens of our own individual as well as our collective experiences. And we do so as a conduit for self-awareness, self-discovery, transformation, and I also like to add transcendence. We have so many case studies within hip hop culture of young men who literally thought and spoke their ways into a new reality from very impoverished and very hard conditions. But we're at a mental health conference and we ask why hip hop matters. Number one, it's the predominant form of youth self-expression around the world. If you have anyone in your life that is under the age of 24, they are very much hip hop influenced. If they don't listen to hip hop every single day, they're very much hip hop influenced. It's the most streamed genre of music in the world, so it literally provides the soundtrack for youth culture and pop culture nowadays. We set the tone and pace for pop culture, so when McDonald's wants to sell head, we're off those words already. But they're still nonetheless because they recognize the value of the music, the culture, as well as the demographic. Last but not least, and this is the part that gets my kids and my students really excited, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that employs hundreds of thousands of creative young people. This is empowering in that for those who are marginalized or made to feel ashamed of who they are, it's an industry that allows you to be embraced without having to scold. I can walk in spaces and never have to use my job interview voice, right? Or my non-threatening black tone. I can be who I am holistically and still be embraced in my culture. Hip hop asks nothing of you but to come as you truly are or as you want to be in your amplified self and facilitates that for you. But I also think it's very aligned with what our theme is. Redefining crazy, it's the 50 years hip hop has been telling America just this, right? We have taken our brutality, we have taken our oppression, and we have used it to become superhumans in the way that we think, in the way that we function, in the way that we act in terms of our talent. And we have been consistently and perpetually telling America about itself in terms of what we have experienced that brought us to this point, right? Or it is the system. It's not the people. It reminds me of a Krishnamurti quote. It is no measure of health to be well-adjusted to a profoundly sick society, right? So when we talk about kids not getting good grades in school or being overly disciplined or being suspended or expelled because of fighting, violence, because their inabilities to sit down, what we're really saying is we're talking about kids. And this is the group of kids that hip hop embraces. The people who aren't with the programming. The people who are looking to unlearn because the world is telling them something about themselves that they intrinsically do not agree with. And that has always been my personal history. There were things that society was telling me, my mother was telling me, my teachers were telling me that I intrinsically did not agree with. And it was my understanding I truly was to the forefront, right? One, maybe because I'm petty and I wanted to prove them wrong, right? But aside from that, it was really to show a pathway of what could be possible if you just take autonomy over your own life as opposed to becoming the figment of somebody else's imagination. And black and brown kids all too often are the figment of the imagination of white supremacy. And this, we'll get into this a little bit later. But let's get into this will be eye-opening and very educational and informative, hopefully, right? Anyone want to tell me where hip-hop starts? The Bronx, New York. You got to give yourselves a round of applause for that. This is a trivia test I do with my kids all the time. So I grew up in Manhattan. I'm a proud uptown boy, right? Born and raised in Washington Heights. For those who don't know about Washington Heights, it's like the Mission District, but with taller buildings and black people who talk Spanish, right? School, alternative performing arts high school, so it was for kids who like to sing, dance, rap, make beats, do all these things, but also got into a lot of trouble. That was me in 8th grade going into 9th grade, right? But hip hop starts in the Bronx, starts in the 1970s. This is the 1970s New York. The rubble that these kids are standing on used to be a building. There were landlords who were burning their buildings down to collect insurance money. There were people who were living or squatting in abandoned buildings. Water. There was an aftermath of poverty and oppression coming out of the 60s. And before we can even talk about the advent of hip hop, we'd be remiss if we don't talk about all the events that came to influence the advent of hip hop, right? Everything that happened in the 1960s, the Vietnam War ending, national recession, bad economy or an economic crisis in New York, high crime, gangs being created among the youth. And when I say the youth, kids as young as 12 and 13 who are belonging to or part of gangs as a means to procure whatever little resources they had in their own neighborhoods, mainly their block. And that dynamic still goes on to this day. But in the midst of all of this, you had the civil rights movement. You obviously had the Black Panther Party over there in Oakland. Right across the bridge, right here, we had the Summer of Love and the counterculture of the hippie happened in UC Berkeley and other universities just recently. People literally thought we were on the verge of another American Revolution, and there were a lot of people who were actively fighting for the very liberties and rights that we often take for granted for, and in many areas of our society we're still fighting for. People like Medgar Evers, assassinated in 1963. John F. Kennedy, also assassinated the same year. Malcolm X in 1965. Martin Luther King. Fred Hampton, who was 21 years old and was the leader of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, killed by police officers. I submit and argue that the death or the imprisonment of people who were fighting for change created a collective trauma. And I'm of the opinion that you can't talk about racism, you can't talk about class, you can't talk about respectability politics or pulling yourself up by your bootstraps in our society without addressing individual. The idea that your entire prefrontal cortex goes offline when you're in a position of fight or flight, right? Again, that explained almost every kid I knew growing up, right? But we're also talking about collective trauma that happens to large groups of individuals, transmitting transgenerationally across communities, war, genocide, slavery, terrorism. How many of this has happened in the last 20 years? These things still exist, and whether we recognize it or are aware of it or not, they still have a profoundly deep effect on us collectively as well as individually, right? In the 1960s, early 70s, you had extreme groups like the Weather Underground, cults like the People's Temple, gangs like the Bloods and Crips being formed, Black Liberation Army, Nation of Gods and Earths, Black Spades in New York, all of them responding to the sign of the time for change mutating into hostility. And from what I understand, hostility is unresolved pain, right? Also, you have the advent of disco music on the heels of the Stonewall riots in the 1960s, right? This gave young people from the LGBT community a space to enjoy themselves, identify with like-minded individuals, play music all throughout the night. This is important because it introduced, which then is picked up and really exemplified at this building, 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx. Now, unbeknownst to a lot of people, hip hop as we know it started with the little girl. Ladies, make some noise, please, please. The little girl that I'm talking about is Cindy Campbell, who at 14 years old had an amazing idea of raising money for school clothes by throwing a back-to-school jam in the community center of her building. The ladies 25 cents. She made about $500 a night. Adjusted for inflation, it's $3,000 today. Right? You could imagine the young girls in my classroom going crazy when they hear that number, right? She hired her older brother, Clive Campbell, otherwise known as DJ Kool Herc, to DJ that party. And at that party, he creates what he then called the merry-go-round style of DJing. It is a performance, and he is taking or isolating the solo drums of each funk record he would play for the party. This drum solo, otherwise known as the breaks, he would remix them and play them back to back in order to extend the beat break and make people dance more or make people dance differently. This style of DJing at this party for young people is what we now know as hip hop culture. It invents what we now know as hip hop. The environment from this style of DJing is where we get our social justice program. It's where we get our wellness program, because literally within a year of this event, there were parties being thrown in the Bronx that were too big for the community centers. They had to put them in the parks, and they called them block parties or block jams. And it's where a lot of gangs who spent years fighting each other violently, killing, robbing, stabbing each other, were able to create by expressing themselves. And if they couldn't solve their differences, they would then battle creatively. DJ battles, breakdance battles, MC battles, so on and so forth. Again, the people who are starting this cultural movement at the time are no older than 18 years old. 13 to 18 years old, and they are creating a wellness program and a social justice program in their own neighborhoods and in their own environments. Absent of any real help, they are self-organizing, they are self-determined, to the point where they create their own ideological framework in the 5 elements and 4 principles of hip hop. This is the actual flyer 50 years ago that Cindy Campbell created to invite people to her party, right? Not knowing that it would be history, right? We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of what was a party in the Bronx that became the biggest cultural movement of the 20th century. So again, for those who are hip hop heads, this is just a refresher. For those who never enjoyed or listened to hip hop or in it the way that I'm in it, these are our 5 elements, right? Very unique in that one is more abstract than the rest of the 4. You have DJing, you have breaking, you have MCing, you have graffiti writing, and then you have knowledge. And knowledge being the one that's the abstract one. But when we say knowledge in hip hop, we're talking becoming, understand, or learning who you are through endeavoring in each of these expressive elements and remixing yourself, ultimately. When we say hip hop is remix culture, what you are ultimately remixing is yourself. This group of elements, these 5 elements, is what allowed young kids in the Bronx to redefine what they were and what they were capable of. The chain snatcher who then became as a chain snatcher, they identified themselves as a breakdancer. They took autonomy over their own lives. They took autonomy over language. They took autonomy over movement. They took autonomy over music. They took autonomy over art. We remixed everything, and we gave it back into the world in a way that made sense for us. We also had 4 core principles. These served as the community agreements of every hip hop party going into having fun. Now in rave culture, they've adopted very similar principles: peace, love, unity, and respect. But originally it was having fun, because it was about enjoying your youth and not being bogged down or aged by the violence, the oppression, and the poverty that was around you, right? Again, these are teenagers creating an ideological framework for an artistic cultural movement that only exists in these parties in the Bronx. By 1970, because people were looting stores and getting DJ equipment, right? For better or for worse. Now, a little bit about our organization. We've been around 10 years. What started as an organization that was mainly grassroots based to give local artists more opportunities to perform, evolved into a fully integrated educational program that goes throughout schools, not only in the Bay Area, but around the country, kindergarten through 12th grade. Grounding taught you all, and then allowing them to endeavor in each of the elements. But what we do is we provide not only culturally responsive, but culturally affirming arts education. Not only using and leveraging your lived experience to explain higher ideals and concepts, but also affirming that your lived experience and who you are culturally and ethnically has value in the educational space, right? It wasn't value add to my educational experience, right? And if we are in an opportunity to teach that to kids in an elementary school, it's very tantamount to me or any of my educators going in class and telling them the same way Nas told me, the world is yours, right? We provide both safe and brave spaces for youth to express themselves and create. I literally just left a group of kids who were having a writing workshop here, right? That's where I was. I didn't wake up to morning, eat this coffee, and just hopped along to a keynote. I was active in my classroom. Right? We provide opportunities for local artists to become leaders and mentors, right? So if you're trying to find your way as an emerging artist who isn't high school age, or maybe a little bit older, you can teach what you know, and we train people to do so. Last but not least, we're doing all of this as a of hip hop culture and Black and brown youth. And we'll get into the details as to why this is so disastrous. But these are just some of the things that we do as an organization, aside from social justice driven events, fundraisers, and a lot of other initiatives when we partner with a lot of different organizations. We've created rap music videos to save our Bay Area waters, to bring attention to the fair chance housing law. We do a lot of videos or multimedia initiatives to raise awareness about socio or political things that are going on in our community. Now, for the future, some of my educators have already gone through this, but this is what we are trying to make standard in terms of our training procedure to mold local artists into actual educators. Not only are you trained in basic classroom checked, you're TB tested, you're trained in trauma-informed care, dynamic mindfulness, restorative justice, and nonviolent communication. More particularly, as you are onboarded as an educator, you take your ACEs test, you take your personality test. From day one, as an educator, you start learning about yourself before you can teach anybody. Right? When I learned my own ACEs score, it explained much more about my behavior in the world and my health conditions and my mental state. It gave me a profound, deep insight into who I was. Same thing with my personality test. I matched our training based on my own experiences, right? And part of the reason I'm standing here is because I'm always in therapy, aside from me doing music and all of that. And it was an experience where my older brother, who I lived with for years, obviously, was having a manic episode and speaking to me on the phone. And as in my head, as I'm telling him or telling myself, he needs therapy, and tell myself, Marlon, if he needs therapy, you need therapy. Because you literally slept head to foot in the same bed in many cases, right? So it was that understanding and that realization that had me endeavor into therapy, and it was a life-changing, life-altering experience for me. Being able to really identify the root cause of a lot of my behavioral issues, and being able to make peace with that, being able to understand and have the faculty and the language to identify emotions that were going on in me, and how they express themselves, whether verbally or otherwise, changed my entire life. And it is those ideals and those understandings that I try to infuse into our general best practices as educators within our organization. Thank you for that. So in terms of programming, we provide interacting and engaging pep rallies and pep rally style presentations as assemblies. This is for groups as young as kindergarten all the way through high school. We do one-off immersive workshops in any of the elements of hip hop. So we're getting kids to actively learn how to DJ, learn how to make beats, learn how to rap, do graffiti art, break dance, infusing themes of multiculturalism, tolerance, wellness, dynamic mindfulness, as well as just healthy self-expression overall. We provide multi-week programs, 6 to 12-week classes, either after school or during the school day, full-day conferences where we right now. We do professional development for educators. So if you're a K through 12th grade educator, we come in and teach you how to use or infuse hip hop into your lesson planning, into your conversations, how to actually have culturally responsive and affirmative pedagogy being practiced in your classroom. And last but not least, we do hip hop community events and activations, like an environmental justice summit that we're planning in August. We are also planning a hip San Francisco Parks and Rec, shout out to them, and other organizations, but this is the work that we do. Let's see. Now, one thing I like to always end off with is because a lot of people have never heard this history before. They've never understood this. Even teenagers who listen to hip hop every single day don't know the founders of this culture. They don't know that teenagers created the culture that they take for granted every day that is now used to sell McDonald's hamburgers, right? And the quick math of it is as follows. 90% of the rap music you listen to is owned by 3 companies: Universal Music, Sony Music, and Warner Music. 80% of the rap that is purchased by suburban white college kids from 18 to 24. Based on Pew Research studies, 75% of white Americans do not have a personal friend of color. 4 white people in America do not have a personal friend of color to understand and empathize with the lived experiences of people of color in our country. So what happens when they consume this music and then become HR? What happens when they consume this music and then become cops who have to patrol the streets of Watts or Compton or Harlem or who are already coming from Iraq with PTSD, right? And they've been conditioned to accept and understand that young black and brown people are hyper-violent, hyper-misogynist, and glorify self-destructive behavior. It becomes a problem. It becomes a very deep problem, right? And now if you listen to a lot of our narratives in our current rap music that is co-opted by these corporations, hyperviolence, hypermisogyny, glorification of drug selling and drug use, hyperconsumption of alcohol. What's happening now at a corporate level is that corporations are complicit in selling and benefiting financially from the normalized dysfunction of black and brown youth, as opposed to healing them. This is why music like Fight the from Dead Prez is now subjugated to the fringe of hip hop culture, why hypermisogyny and all of those things take front and center stage, right? We've gone the last month in hip hop culture talking about a rap beef because that sells more records and people pay more attention to conflict in our culture than they do to empowerment and upliftment. And this is directly resulting, or this is directly related to the 30 some odd years, right? Since 1996, when hip hop becomes a $1 billion industry, and at the same time, the Telecommunications Act is implemented that allows corporations to buy up small mom and pop radio stations. The narrative of hip hop that had groups like Public Enemy, at the same time they had NWA, at the same time that you had Wu-Tang, at the same time that you had MC Lyte and Queen Latifah, at the same time you had Terminator X and X-Clan and Tribe Called Quest. Everybody sounds the same. Everybody has the same story, and everybody is encouraging you into the same self-destructive behavior that is making so much money for these corporations that then have investments in the private prison industrial complex, right? Who also make textbooks, by the way. So it's the same three companies on one level or another, not only giving you the textbooks to teach your kids, but giving them music created themselves. Right? We're not having a big enough conversation in our culture about how our own culture is being co-opted as a social engineering mechanism to put black and brown people in jail. And it's our organization, along with a lot of other organizations in this ilk, in this milieu, a lot of other people who are doing the work on their own in their rural communities, who are trying to take the culture back so that we could continue to spark the brain. So on that note, I appreciate y'all time. I will open it up for questions if there are any. Thank you very much. I know I think we're a little bit over, but if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to field any questions.
No question, just a comment. I think you're brilliant. Continue doing it.
Thank you very much for that. Appreciate that. I see a question right here. No problem. Appreciate that. Thank you. Last call for questions. Yes, thank you for that. If there are no other questions, again, I appreciate your time. Make some noise for yourselves. Self-love is the best kind of love. Talk to y'all soon.